All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. I am really excited to introduce our keynote speaker, Reverend Dr. Starsky Wilson. I heard him speak a couple years ago, and I knew, well, no, a little over a year ago at the Pizzagatti lecture, and I knew that I had to get him in front of you. Dr. Wilson is president and CEO of the Children's Defense Fund, or CDF, and the CDF Action Council. CDF envisions a nation where marginalized children flourish, leaders prioritize their well-being, and communities wield the power to ensure that they thrive. And I'm sure you can see the connections to MedSEP's mission to promote broad prosperity for every Marylander, and for allowing them to achieve their full potential. He is also board chair for the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy and the Forum for Theological Exploration. Before he was there, from 2011 to 2020, Reverend Wilson was president and CEO of the Deaconess Foundation, which is a faith-based philanthropy for child well-being and racial justice in St. Louis. And from 2008 through 2018, he also pastored the St. John's Church, a multiracial congregation in the city, which after the police killing of Michael Brown, Jr., hosted the Black Lives Matter Freedom Ride and other mobilizations. In fact, Dr. Wilson was appointed co-chair of the Ferguson Commission, which released the Forward Through Ferguson, A Path Towards Racial Equity report, calling for sweeping changes in policing, the courts, child well-being, and economic mobility in 2015. We will, like our panels, have some time for Q&A with Reverend Dr. Wilson after his remarks, so continue to submit your questions using the same URL and code that you've used before. And that is on the screens, or will be in a moment. I really appreciate the time and willingness to share his words of wisdom with us, and please help join me in inviting Dr. Wilson to the dais. I have my paper out of your way.
Got it. Good evening. I am glad to be here on this historic location in order to celebrate this historic milestone for the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. I'm grateful for the invitation from Ben, from Reverend Slayton, others who were willing enough to call my name, and now my job is to not embarrass them for the next few minutes. We bring you greetings on behalf of the staff, the volunteers, the board, those who work and serve across the country with and for America's children through the Children's Defense Fund. We're excited and delighted to be partners with you in this work and excited to celebrate this particular milestone with you. What I really want to do for a few moments, because I am a preacher and I am an organizer, and so I will try to rhetorically agitate you. And so I really do want to provoke some conversation for us who find ourselves common in this work, common enough that on a cold and damp night that is a Saturday in the holiday season, we decided to be together talking about and celebrating a decade of valuable work to advance a vision of an economy that allows all people to thrive. And so my presumption is this is not a conversion moment. Rather, this is a moment where we get to build and deepen together because we decided to be here. Is that all right? And so what I wanted to try to do is invoke in this conversation some thoughts around a movement for mobility. A movement for mobility. I'll do so from a bit of a perch. This is the perch. If we had had this event when we were supposed to have this event, it would have been before I had the occasion and had in my memory the 50th anniversary of the Children's Defense Fund. At the beginning of November, we gathered together with friends from across the country to celebrate and to mark the 50th anniversary of CDF and to begin to think about, we had our own Sankofa moment, to look back in order to move forward, to consider the essence of the past in order to consider how we propel ourselves into the future, to go back and get the things that were so valuable for us over the course of 49 years and service to 2 generations of America's children so we might be thoughtful about how we appropriately and effectively serve another generation of America's children. And because you find yourself at a milestone as well, then I'll climb to the perch institutionally of big sister, big sibling, and consider what are the things that we might, at a milestone of a decade, consider for the Maryland Center for Economic Policy in the same way that we began to consider looking back how we might think about a new vision for children in America at CDF. Is that okay? And part of what I want to center for you is one of the things we wrestled with, which is a shift in our thinking, in our rhetoric, and our orientation, with our roots in the briefcase of Marian Wright Edelman, the briefcase that held the policy agenda for a Poor People's Campaign. As she did as the policy director for that mobilization to Washington, D.C. As she calls CDF, the grandchild of that Poor People's Campaign, working to advance a vision that ameliorated poverty in America. Part of what we did when we gathered for 2 days at Howard University to consider our policy agenda going forward is we articulated our ambition to shift from a conversation about child poverty to a conversation about economic mobility. It had several different layers in it, and so grounded in that shift, I want to invite you into a conversation with us and maybe agitate a conversation with you about a movement for mobility. Is that okay? That's what I'm up to, and this is how I'll try to get at it. I'll define that, Jerome, and I won't use as much math as you want me to, but that's exactly where I want to go. First, I got to go back in order to go forward. I got to go back to that briefcase and to that apartment in Washington, D.C. that rooted the Poor People's Campaign, because CDF was really, we said it was 50 years, but really we were founded as a Washington Research Project in 1969. The Washington Research Project was really oriented more around making the case in a rational political environment, making a reasoned and grounded case for how we might shift policy, especially economic policy, in order to advance a situation where Americans may thrive. And by 1973, Marian made the designation that there was a certain moral calculus that was needed because something happened. Something happened as we read in the nation. Number one, the nation stopped caring about poor people. Grown poor people who were fully formed and through the lens of rugged individualism were not enough to move the nation to do a thing. We were not caring about whether they were black or whether they were white, whether they were southern, whether they were northern. We didn't care about poor people, but we might just be able to care about children. And making a moral case for economic policy shifting through the lens of children might be valuable. So the Washington Research Project pushed all of its chips into an initiative called the Children's Defense Fund. 1973. And for that first generation of America's children, what we began to do is to make a policy-focused, research-based case as a public interest law firm that we ought to change public policy on behalf of children. And from 1973 through the mid-1990s, that was the work and our orientation around it. It, of course, produced some powerful works, including not only our State of America's Children report annually, but foundational reports that still find themselves from 1974. That first report on children out of school in America is still resonant on the HHS website because it was that groundbreaking in helping people to understand that when you actually go into community, I'm making an argument for something here, I'll come back later. When you go into community and you knock on doors and you ask mamas, big mamas, and abuelitas why their kids are out of school, you get better data and information than if you just ask the people at the university. And making that case, we began to understand issues that were keeping keeping children out of the access to school, the same schools that we told them were the access point to economic freedom in America. And so that kind of groundbreaking research really grounded our first generation. We founded as other anti-poverty institutions and organizations that also celebrate 50 years this year. Last year, Sojourners. Last year, our friends at the Network Lobby for Social Justice. This year, our friends at Faith in Action, these anti-poverty organizations grounded at the same time trying to mobilize people around this vision, spent the first generation trying to make a rational case based upon research in a reasonable political environment that you should shift policy on behalf of children, and did so with some success. But something happened in the 1990s. Can I talk history for a second? In the 1990s, a couple of different things happened. Number one, there was a shift in the political environment that had been moving since the early 1990s, began to take center stage in the mid-1990s when I was in high school, by the way. I was in high school. But I paid attention to these things. With the immediate past chair of something called the Democratic Leadership Council being elected to the presidency after being the immediate past chair when Bill Clinton came into the White House that same year, something called the Center for Responsible Government. It was the Republican Leadership Council, same thing, a moderation of the national public conversation. So all of these anti-poverty activists, these folks who have been planting institutions on the progressive side in order to shift public policy, in order to begin to work within the context and the system in the 1990s. Successful in lifting people out of poverty. Now, if you, like many others in rooms like this, have read Matthew Desmond's work on poverty in America, then you would look at the same 30-year period and say, maybe not so much. So let's say it's in the eye of the beholder. But we have had a 30-year theory of the case that has had at least some marginal impact on lifting people out of poverty, a vision of the economy with a strategy focused specifically on expanding the social safety net that has lifted people out of poverty. These things are good. If I was in church, I'd say it's been good for us to be here. And something has happened over the life of this organization and in the environmental context that created it. What I want to say, I look back 10 years and I think about something you actually mentioned in my introduction, Ben. I'm preparing to go to St. Louis next year about 6 times. 6 times I will go to St. Louis next year. Why? Because there are many gatherings of socially oriented philanthropists and people who care about economic justice and people who care about racial justice and people who care about diversity, equity, and inclusion and people who care about child well-being who are all going to St. Louis next year. Again, I don't live there anymore, but I got to go back to hang out with them. I should have kept my house there. They're going back because next year is the 10th anniversary of a youth uprising that was years in the making. A youth uprising that introduced me first to the language of economic mobility. A youth uprising that caused me to begin to curate a language and a definition based in my local community of child well-being. A youth uprising that caused us to turn our attention as a region to organizing a mass plan calibrating 30,000 citizens toward a vision of racial equity. A youth uprising that had already been years in the making, because between you and your organization were founded between uprisings that people called Occupy, that shifted the discussion about economic imbalances and inequities, and the first national mobilization of something called the Movement for Black Lives, which was the Ferguson Uprising. You were founded between a discussion about while we were working inside the Beltway with a particular fiscal strategy in order to move things incrementally, in order to get things done in a pragmatic way, there were young people in New York who decided to occupy a park. While we were talking about how we should make a case and we were trying to bring people and give expert testimony before congressional committees, there were young people who did not have citizenship status who actually changed the conversation about immigration in America. While we were engaging in our inside the Beltway conversation about how we would get things done through legislative strategy based upon our assessment that we actually had reasonable, legitimate political actors in that place. And in these places, in Annapolis, and in Jefferson City, and in Austin, and in Columbus, Ohio, when we were doing that, young people were organizing in communities and mobilizing in ways that actually changed the narrative and the discussion. And unfortunately, many of us didn't keep up. I speak for us as an institution. We didn't keep up with the intervention that we were making even into ourselves. The Children's Defense Fund, about 30 years ago, organized with a group of black leaders across the country something called the Black Community Crusade for Children. It expressed itself through different ways, including the establishment of something called the Black Student Leadership Network. The Black Student Leadership Network organized across the country for 7 years, mobilized young people, taught them community organizing, helped them to understand how to analyze policy issues, then sent them forth on organizing projects across the country. And they did that for 7 years, and they would argue, while there's someone who was once called America's mayor, who would argue that broken windows policing is what led to a decrease in crime in the 1990s. They would argue that community organizing and young people who went back to their communities to intervene actually grows. But, you know, those who write the books determine history. That intervention didn't take well in our midst, and maybe it didn't take well in other midsts, but it has told a story for us that has been documented in the book After the Rebellion by one of those young leaders at the time who's now a leading political scientist by the name of Sekou Franklin. And when he writes about young student movements post-civil rights, he tells the story of the Black Student Leadership Network and its power. And I take that as an intervention and an example for what we might do right now. Jerome, I'm getting there. Here I am. I learned from looking back at that inflection point for the second generation that CDF served, seeking to end child poverty in America. At the same time that we were trying to organize young people deployed in community, we were also gathering the largest mobilization for young people in American history, something called the Stand for Children rally in Washington, D.C. Marion stood powerfully on the Mall. But I think we also missed something, if I can be reflective there. I think we missed a moment and an opportunity to give the movement over to those young people and to follow their strategies. And so, before you get to 25 years here at 10, I want to offer a few things as you focus on economic policy and you seek to do a thing that can easily become an incrementalist inside baseball conversation. Especially in a moment where you have friends in Annapolis, like we once had friends in the White House, whether those friends were named Clinton or those friends were named Obama. What I want to offer to you is to keep this moment as an opportunity to continue to curate not the best economic policy that can make change for now, but to take this moment as the moment to have and to take the room to curate a transformative economic vision for the state of Maryland and one for America. I want to suggest to you and agitate to you that this is not the time to say we've got friends and so we can get things done. It's rather to say we got friends, we can get things done, and this allows us to push even further and not to make the mistake of taking those friends as people that you should not push, but rather understanding that, as Dr. Manuel Pastor said, he said that the mistake we made when Obama went to the White House is we all went back and we clapped and we appreciated that we did the good work together to get him there. We did not go back to our our communities, to organize like hell, to put wind at his back, to get things done that we should still have been telling him to get done. And I'm suggesting to you as I stand here as a new Marylander, one who had the opportunity to vote for a brother who voted for me. Westmore was on the search committee. They called me to CDF. We worked together when he was working in philanthropy and I was working in philanthropy as well. I was excited and delighted to get to vote for him in my first election here in Maryland. And I'm saying, let's go organize like hell to give wind at the back of one who is a friend in order to make him do the things that he would want to do in the beginning and he will find complicated right now. I wasn't supposed to talk politics, but let me just get back to my notes. I do have notes, Jerome. Black preacher, I got 3 things I want to suggest to you, just 3. In order to keep a focus on this transformed economy, which is the work, right? It is not just shifting legislative moments and policies, but a transformation of the economy. I invite you to do 3 things. Number 1, I invite you to renew the mobility aspiration. Jerome said, what kind of mobility? Economic mobility. What I'm talking about, Jerome, is the fact that I was raised, I told you that in the 1990s I was in high school. That means in 1989 I was in middle school when we were arguing and we were shifting the conversation at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, when we were shifting it away from children's rights and to parents' rights, when we in America were doing that, even though we wouldn't sign off. Part of what was happening was you were teaching a generation like me, I'm a Gen Xer, you were teaching me that if I defer gratification, get an education, and work hard, I could do better than my parents. Now, I hang out, I read Ross Chetty, I hang out with the people from Gates. I understand they have a nice formal sociological definition of economic mobility. Economic mobility is really the promise and the commitment that you can do better than your mama and them. That's what I was raised on. That's what I tried to raise my children on, and yet I found it to be a lie. My middle-class black children, the 3 black boys that I'm raising in my house, are more likely, according to the Opportunity Insights research from Harvard University, they are more likely to end up poor than to stay middle class. They have the greatest indicators of child well-being in their life. The greatest indicator of child well-being, the health well-being, the long-term prosperity of a child is the education level of the mother. I married a doctor. They should be all right. But the racial dynamics and the disruptions to the economy that have visited their lives have suggested that they won't. The young people who gathered around the body of Michael Brown 10 years ago looked down at him in the shadow of the University of Missouri, St. Louis, and they saw that they were the most educated generation in American history. Millennials are. And because of economic disruptions and shifts in the economy and economic policy and our ability, our willingness to allow those who have a lot to aggregate more to themselves and not pay those who are at the lower rungs, they will not do as well as their parents, even though they were told that they would if they would defer gratification, get an education, and work hard. It doesn't matter because the ground has shifted around them. And so what I'm suggesting is if we're going to renew the mobility aspiration, that is a plank, a critical plank in the idea of the American dream, then we have to begin to shift the environment around them and shift our focus and our gaze from them. It's not just about whether you defer gratification, get an education, even learn math and work hard. It's rather about whether we're actually willing to shift the landscape around. This requires something else, and I want to get at it, but I want to make sure I leave time for conversation. First, we have to renew that mobility aspiration. This has to do with the shift that we made. If you see somebody at CDF talking to you about child poverty as anything but an indicator and the best indicator we got, then you tell me, because they're not following the direction we've laid out in our strategy. Poverty doesn't motivate anybody. I'm sorry. I sat in enough convenings, especially in the Obama era, with administration officials, knowing that they cared about poor people and wondering why they didn't talk about poverty. Because nobody sees themselves as poor. Because people don't see poor people as a political organizing benefit to them and their self-interest. And frankly, because we've learned things about asset framing and goal framing that suggest that that's not the way to lead into a conversation. And we policy people love a problem. I'm not saying let go of your problem. I'm saying talk to people about the promise of the aspiration of mobility. Talk to people about the great things that young people can do if you unleash the barriers before you talk about the problem and the promise. Talk about the promise before you talk about the problem. Then offer them your policy. But the promise that we have is economic mobility, and we commit to that again and not just stopping bad things from happening, then I think we have a more hopeful future. Number one, we need to renew the mobility aspiration, talking about economic mobility. Number two, we need to reorient our moral authority. You know, one of the things I had to tell people when I came into this job at Children's Defense Fund, I said, I know I'm a preacher, but you know what I'm not? I am not an 80-year-old civil rights leader who has won the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Our capacity to curate moral authority based upon my predecessor's long and deep history in this country as what anybody would call an aspirational, inspirational American is not going to work. And neither will the public theology that she did. And I say that as a preacher, but I recognize that religious affiliation does not curate moral authority in an America that is much less religious. And much of our strategy, including of turning out religious people in order to do a thing and to move politicians, is something that is increasingly, if I quote Walter Brueggemann, it is increasingly outmoded and difficult to pull off. Moral authority is not in the voice of elders. Moral authority is not not in religious affiliation. I want to argue that moral authority for our work today is connected to our proximity to the people that it impacts. Our moral authority has everything to do with saying, who sent you? I have a political mentor by the name of Mike Jones. Who? Mike Jones. Hip-hop people get that. In St. Louis, Missouri. And Mike Jones is one out of the student movement, the black student movement, the first black student movement after the civil rights movement. And he talks about the difference to me all the time. We're in a small room, so I'm assuming that I can be frank and be open. Can I do that? Okay. He talks to me all the time about the difference between African-American elected officials and black politicians. And he says African-American is a census category. Black has to do with a commitment to a community and a cosmology that sends you forth and holds you accountable. And he says that politicians are people who understand power, and elected officials are people who can get themselves into office. Those are two different things. That power thing I'll come back to in a minute, but what he suggests to me in this distinction between African American and black is that a black person and those who serve black people should always be able to answer the question, who sent you? It is an accountability question. What I'm saying here is that moral authority has to do with knowing that someone told us to come forward. You know what I frustrated with people with for 2 years, the Children's Defense Fund? For 2 years, people at Children's Defense Fund asked me, so what's our new policy agenda? They expected that I had all of the answers. And I know that's the way we think of these things. Some new leader comes in, they got a big box they open up, and they got the magical answer. No. What we did was we spent 2 years listening to the families. We serve 15,000 families a year in 30 states. And we spent 2 years listening to them, asking them about what our public policy agenda should be, asking them about how we should define child well-being, asking them about what they wanted us to talk about. And now, just in November of this year, after frustrating people for 2 years, we said this will be our policy agenda for going forward. And we say it in the grounding that they sent us, those that we serve. I want to suggest to you that your policy agenda will not meet in Annapolis or in Washington, D.C., legitimate political actors making rational decisions based upon who is going to benefit. They're not legitimate, frankly. I'm speaking more about Washington, D.C. than I am about Maryland, because it's my first time living in the blue state. Sorry. I'm referring to the background, not anything else. People are not making political decisions, and you will hear it over the course of the next year, based upon what's best for people who are voting for them. They're making political decisions based upon people, based upon what's best for them and their interests. We've already designed and carved up districts where they don't have to care about people. They can choose their constituencies rather than their constituencies choosing them. And so what I'm saying to us, that our moral authority can't be in that, and we have to have something else to wield for them. First, we have to have a commitment to mobility. Second, we have to have a different kind of moral authority. And last, we have to have a movement orientation, accept a movement orientation. I'm going to take some of this to another group next week. I'll be down in Atlanta with the Economic Security Project, and part of what I'm trying to say to our economic advocates everywhere I go is this, that there's 30 years where we focused on the expansion of the social safety net was good, and we might have just wrung it all out. We have found out through the context of the pandemic that we could do more if we actually had the moral energy to do it. But as we learned, we can fight for 50 years to end child poverty in America. We can cut it in half in a year. And because of a lack of moral courage and suasion, we can have it spike up double in the next year. And so if we think we are dealing with legitimate political actors for which we can just make a policy case without taking a movement orientation, which says, yes, we're not going to give up our fiscal policy, but we're also going to move corporate structures. We'll seek to hold them accountable, because guess what? Whether you like them or not, the minimum wage is higher at Walmart than it is in the federal government. And so we got to find other ways to do this work outside, and we have to take a movement orientation. Movement suggests we got to make the grass tops golden. Movement suggests we do need a theory of the economy, but we also need a theory of governance. And it means those same people who listen to us to ground our moral authority and say we sent them, we have to be able to bring them along with us. So a movement mentality suggests that Ben doesn't ever have to go alone. But there's going to be mamas, big mamas, and abuelitas with him in Annapolis. Movement mentality suggests that when there are those like Kevin who are politically preaching, there are people who are saying, amen, hallelujah, and this is the policy we want. As this organization moves to serve young people and children and families across this community and across this state like mine, looking out for my 8-year-old baby girl and my 18-year-old college student, that you will never have to do this work alone. A movement orientation and a moral authority suggests we will work inside the political lines, inside the policy lines, and we will work in the streets as well. And I say that based upon my own 10-year anniversary. I didn't come to this alone. I came to this because young people in the midst of an America that told them that if we graduated from high school like Mike did, that if they deferred gratification and did all right, if they lived in the suburbs, like the dividing line between an unaccredited school district, a non-accredited school district, and an accredited school district, like the one on which Michael Brown died, that they would be all right. America lied to them, and I refused to lie to them. And so, because they refused to have anybody lie to them, they went outside in movement fashion. They decided they were going to stay until somebody gave them answers. And they stayed long enough till a governor had to answer and appoint a Ferguson Commission. That Ferguson Commission had to study the issues enough to rumble across the language of economic mobility. And in those sessions, educating people about economic mobility began to craft for the community a definition of racial equity and child well-being. And that's my policy introduction. I'm not a policy expert. I'm an organizer and a preacher, and I came to agitate you to listen to the young people who introduced me to this work. And let that energize your next 10 years. Thank you.
You can see why I brought him. We are going to continue taking questions through the app, so please submit your questions through the app. And I'm going to start with a question that I think flips this a little bit on its head. In your remarks, you make the argument, and I 100% agree with you, that the energy that our young people have is really important to pay attention to and to value and follow in many ways. And at the same time, you and I are the same age, approximately, I think, considering when you went to high school.
Thank you.
We have things that we've learned over the years as well. And so we have things to learn from them. What would you share with the younger generation that you want to share that you've learned over that time?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, stories. I really do think this kind of telling our stories of both our triumphs and challenges really matters. This thing about like not holding guilt, about not doing better, just the economic narrative I just talked about what I was taught, right? Yes, I'm telling my kids to do well in school, and that will not make you do better in America, right? We have to tell them that based upon our actual experience and what we've seen, mostly what we've seen from a generation that came behind us, because it marginally worked for us. So in the 1940s, 90% of Americans who entered the workforce did better than their parents. Now it's 40%. I mean, this is serious generational slide. So we have to tell them that so they don't carry, especially for this generation who wrestles with social emotional wellness, wrestles with identity and comparison because of social media, that if they don't do better, they actually take it on themselves. And so that does two things. Number one, it harms them individually. It also strips them of the challenge of collective civic agency. Right? If you actually want to do better, then what you have to do is vote. If you actually want to do better, then you have to shift the economy. If you actually want to do better, then you have to change policy. If you actually, you may need to organize for a union in your workplace, and you need to think about that as a strategy for you doing better. And so we invite them into a political agency by doing that. The other thing that and it gets to your point actually, the other thing I try to talk to them about and try to be pretty open about is mutual mentorship. My friend at Faith in Action, Michael Ray Matthews, talks about co-generational work. This idea that we've got to do the work together. I'm very intentional about my audience choice from a communication standpoint. When I'm talking to older people, I tell them to listen to young people. When I'm talking to young people, I tell them stories about how to connect with elders. I learned a lot by listening and sitting at the feet of elders, but I also recognize more and more, the older I get, I gotta be intentional about who I keep around me. And so now I got some privilege with that. I get to hire people. So the people who are closest to me are generally younger people, like on a regular, everyday basis. And so I try to teach that too. Right, just by that modeling. So I think that's part of the work of learning. The last thing I'll say is we have to create space, and this is a responsibility of those of us in this generation. We have institutional proximity. We have institutional privilege. We actually can set tables now, right? We're executive directors, right? Right? We get to set tables, and so part of our responsibility is to set tables for political and policy education. One of the most powerful things that previous generation I referred to at Children's Defense Fund established in the 1990s was something called the Ella Baker Child Policy Training Institute. I was like, oh man, we expanding that thing. Like as soon as I came, I was like, hey, we're gonna give it time. But like we're gonna go back to what it means to train under that umbrella. Train for community organizing, but also train on public policy. So we've reestablished our Black Student Leadership Network with that specific thing in mind. So those are things that we have to teach as well.
You're reminding me of something that I've said privately to friends about my children. You know, my goal as a parent is I look forward to the day when they teach me how to be a better person.
Yeah.
And that's where we want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll push you. I mean, they may not do it explicitly and didactically, but shoot, man, my 8-year-old is doing it to me right now. Right? In the model, like, there's a certain joy that I deserve that she takes. I deserve it, she takes it, right? And the more I take it, the better person I am. I ain't got to hold all of this stuff all the time, right? And so I think there's a witness and a wonder in young people that I think we ought to hold up, so sorry.
So, the next question I have is, I'm actually going to skip around here a little bit. And maybe this is a question really that you can answer far better than I can. But how do you navigate the sensitivity of advocating against leaders that look like you when the public opinion says that you are hurting or hating on your own? That's a deep question that I don't have a great answer for.
Yeah, I don't. I mean, I really don't. And I hope it wasn't perceived that I was doing it here.
I don't think that's where the question comes from. But.
Yeah, I think it's important for us to have a full analysis of what roles people play and have clarity about our sense of call vis-a-vis those roles and the roles that we play. Part of my political formation, I'll be very clear, part of my political formation happened through a construction that's called the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference. The Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference is a 20-year-old gathering of predominantly African-American clergy who are committed to Black liberation theology, founded by one Reverend Dr. Jeremiah A. Wright Jr., the former pastor of our former president. I came to pastor a United Church of Christ congregation in St. Louis in 2008. when the two most popular members of the United Church of Christ, this predominantly white progressive denomination with 3% black people, were these two black men. What I came to recognize at sitting at the feet of Baba J, right, in that, was that the role, I'll quote Baba J here, the role that President Obama ran for and was elected to in a historical construction is the role of Pharaoh, not the role of Moses. It is not the role of the liberator. It is the leader of the state that is at the center of empire globally. And so one must situate oneself with accountability to that role, even if you love that person. And so that's the clarity with which I think child advocates, I think policy advocates, I think those who find themselves in spaces who desire the transformation of an economy and governance must understand themselves as like, these are people in roles, people whom we love.
Oh, we just lost the battery, I think. Maybe use the other, yeah, just click it up.
Yeah, I've been in enough places where they turn the mic off on me to know that I should have two. That we lovingly hold accountable, and we stay in relationship long enough, as long as we can. We stay in relationship in the interest of that vision, right? So I think that's what it's really about for me. I don't know that I found myself to have to engage in public or direct political critique of anyone who looks like me in that way. I think that's the construction of the question. But I do find myself always responsible to educate folks who sent me forth about what our responsibility is vis-a-vis these roles, not these people. And I think that's an important thing for us. And I say it based on our history too. I mean, I think, I'm looking through your mask. I think this brother here understood when I talked about the kind of chasm that came up between the Clinton administration and CDF. And this was over kind of a commitment to welfare to work. It was, Peter Edelman, Marian Ray Edelman's husband, walked away from the administration. Marian, a very big falling out with Hillary, who was a mentee of hers. But it was a commitment to the vision and the work and understanding even those whom we deeply love may not be, because of the systems and because of empire, may not be able to faithfully pursue that vision in their roles. And frankly, they need us to create space for them and to hold them accountable when that happens, to call them to themselves or to call them into what they want to be doing and the role won't allow them to do it. So that's how I hold,
Thank you.
Yeah, hold legitimacy in that.
I think there's a question from the audience also about expanding a little bit about what government policies you are focused on when we're talking about encouraging more economic upward mobility or economic mobility generally, the policies that CDF is focused on or that you see more globally, if you could expand on that a little bit more.
Yeah, I appreciate the question. First, CDF is a partner with the Center for the Study of Social Policy and leading a coalition of 70 organizations that are pursuing guaranteed, what's called the Automatic Benefit for Children Coalition. It is seeking a universal child allowance that is more akin to the expanded child tax credit that we had in 2021, making that permanent in American life as it is in the life of every other English-speaking industrialized nation on the face of the globe. To say that if you have children, and if we affirm that children are the stability and the future of a community, then you should receive resources on a regular basis to help raise your children in America. That is our commitment. So again, the closest we came to it was 2021, not exactly with the expanded child tax credit, not exactly it, but that's what we're looking at. You can think of it as universal basic income for children or a guaranteed income for children. This is one where we are ramping up our work, and we saw the success in that moment, and we want to continue to build out that work. We have in our offices in New York, in Minnesota, and in California, we have folks working on UBI initiatives for different groups or categories of young people in New York, the largest effort for young people aging out of foster care, engaging with this kind of direct support cash transfer support in Minnesota, working with the calculator for the UBI initiative for the city and the region, and in California also looking at this effort for young people aging out of foster care. So this is a critical one for us. We also continue to seek to advance and work for, this is not exactly the same kind of economic, but universal free school meals. So partnering with folks like Food Corps, understanding that this is something that, number one, has saved school districts money, number two, has made sure young people have access to nourishing meals, and number three, reduces the shame and stigma of young people having to go through a certain line or go through a certain process. And so this is something that is also related to economics. We continue, of course, to push. Years ago, I think it was 2018 was the last time we updated it, something that was then called the End Child Poverty Now report. Continue to advance higher $15 minimum wage, continue to work toward the elimination of student debt in America. This same narrative that tells you to get an education, deferred gratification, you can do better than your parents, is the one that invited people into student loans that had them locked up, tied up, and still strangled up in a system where they actually can't do better. We learned the universal lessons of the fees must fall movement in South Africa, where young people are saying 20 years after Mandela, 20 years after Truth and Reconciliation, that it is actually the opening of the door to education, but then the interlocutor of debt that is creating a worse situation for them. And so seeking and advancing toward canceling student loan debt is still something that we are working toward, and increasingly my young staff want to make sure that we get that done as well. So these are things that are part of that economic agenda for us, and we're being more thoughtful. I'm part of an exploration right now within philanthropy about other kinds of supports that advance economic mobility, including how we might be thoughtful about inclusive zoning and how that support helps to work to make, pulling together alliances, local alliances for inclusive zoning, and thinking about how that support actually helps people build the kinds of assets and retain the assets that make an economic floor possible. So we're seeking to be creative, but from a federal level, those are some of the things that we're advancing. And I say federal about the UBI piece, but we're also affirming and trying to find places to work with the states that took the opportunity over the course of the last 18 months to advance. I want to say there were something like 15 states that advanced expanded child tax credits at the state level over the course of the last 18 months, taking the example of the pandemic. And so that's part of what we're trying to lean in and throw in with folks like the Economic Security Project to build on that in locations across the country as well.
We'll actually have staff at the Economic Security Project conference next week, and
I promise I won't give the same talk. I promise.
Well, they won't tell anybody. And I'm just thinking about here in Baltimore City, we have free school meals for every child, and it makes a huge difference. I can see in the lives of my kids' classmates. I want to take the moderator prerogative of asking the last question, and this might,
it's not the hardest one.
Well, it might seem like an odd one. But I think I want us to end on a moment of hope. But I'm really curious. You talked about, well, I think that often what we face as organizers, as think tank people who work at think tanks who have access, but even as grassroots organizers, is fear. And whether it's fear of loss of access, or as I think you worked with young people who might have feared for their lives in Ferguson, or we might fear for our safety in this very fraught political environment that may continue to get worse. How do you see, or what was your experience, how people overcame that fear? How do we overcome that fear? How do we act and do the right thing despite the fear, despite the fear that we might lose our status, or that we might face actual threats of violence? I'm really want to close on a moment of hope, but I'm opening my question with fear.
Yeah, first, from fear to reality, if you're in any room with me, you ain't got that much status, no way. So I think level setting what we think we might lose. I'd say that as a joke, but I say it as real. Like, really? Lose what? We've taken their worst. Individually, perhaps not. Collectively, it's been worse. We have taken the worst, and yet we're here. Critical to accepting that affirmation is the acceptance of the collective pronoun, we. We find strength in the community by rejecting isolation and individualism. I was on my way here. I've had a hard time finding a church. And I can find a church. They ain't that hard to find. But to find one I want to stay in, raise my kids in, or find inspiration in, I joined the church, but even like once I joined, then I was like, this is why it's so hard. I pastored the church for 10 years, so I'm also biased, you know what I'm saying? On the way here, on the drive, I love driving. I don't like driving in DC traffic, but I like open road highway driving because I can listen to things. On the way here, I stumbled across a clip on social media. It kind of said it and just kind of finding stuff of this preacher, Tellis Chapman, celebrating the goodness of God. And he was celebrating in a way that I remember, I felt it in my spirit from my youth, in ways that I ain't really felt it in a long time. And I realized it wasn't him, but he was activating something in the community that rose up around him that he got happy and started celebrating. And then I, in the car, felt energized and began to celebrate. And so there's something in the communities that we connect with on a regular basis. So when I say church, I mean voluntary association. I mean synagogue, mosque, and temple. I mean the place you choose to go when you ain't got to go nowhere. I'm saying the place where nobody's getting, well, maybe a couple people, but generally people not getting paid to hang out with each other. I'm not talking about the definition of a corporation where people get paid to hang out with people that they don't like. No. There's something in community that holds us and keeps us in the face of fear. So first, I want to say that there's something we got to find in a collective. No, first, level set, what are you losing? Second, find a community of support, encouragement, and inspiration, whatever that looks like and feels like, so that you understand that your identity is there, not in whatever you might lose. Third, understand the definition of child well-being. I talk to a lot of child advocates, people who self-identify as child advocates, and I say to them, full disclosure, I have 4 children, I say to them, everybody who does this work sustainably has one child. One child that when you see their face, when you imagine their face, you can't help but smile. And you gotta have a regular practice of seeing them. Whether you can physically see them, you might just see them around the holidays, you get to see them once a year. If it's your nephew or your niece, you gotta travel to see. But you gotta find, literally, sometimes even a meditative practice of imagining them. Because for me, I hang out, I read these scholars. Got a friend by the name of Ramesh Raghavan. Ramesh writes books about child well-being. He has a new book about investing in children's mental health, and he talks about the journey toward child well-being, and he walks through the history in America of us getting toward child well-being, something that other countries have affirmed in their governments, and we haven't done that. But he constructs a definition. He's got a whole social definition, and I walk through his definition. His definition has been embedded in the theory of change at the Children's Defense Fund. We had him come speak at our policy forum. He's a good scholar. He's at New York University about this thing. But I tell him, I say, I appreciate all that, but the definition of child well-being is this: children who are safe, secure, who understand themselves to be seen, and in sanctuary in a community, sing and dance like nobody's watching. When I see I got 4 children, but when I see that 8-year-old sing and dance, that keeps me in the Word. There is nothing that can overwhelm the feeling in my heart, fear, challenge, anything else, when I'm thinking about her dancing. And I understand that I'm doing this work because I need her to be able to dance. That's the thing I think we need. We need a vision of joy, of well-being, especially of children, that will help us to center around the future and the work. We need a community of support that inspires us. We need to level set that we ain't really got that much to lose, so we may as well risk for a better future.
Thank you. We all have, this has been tremendous, and I really appreciate the remarks.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're going to have a little bit of a reception outside, and so please feel free to take advantage of that. And thank you for joining us today and tonight. It's been a pleasure, and it's been, I know we took a couple months to get here, but it's really been a pleasure to be here with you in partnership and community with you. I started out my remarks at the beginning saying that I couldn't do this alone. I started this organization and I was the only person here, and I knew that was not the way to do this work. You can see how to keep in touch with us, and with that, I will turn this microphone off and let's go have some fun and food and drink.